Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn from icy cold North Germany with minus felt temperature of minus 10 degrees Celsius outside today, and it's not pleasant to walk the dogs. So, unfortunately, my guest is about to get hit by something of that nature, I think, today. At least the weather forecasts that I've heard indicate that. So, but I'm very happy to have a guest that, at long last, published a book that is what I felt a real page turner. It was fun reading that book. It was very enjoyable, great new perspective. So I'm very happy to be joined today by Jennifer Lynn Gross. She is, uh, well, she has a very complicated life, I suppose. She is a graduate from the University of Georgia, 2001, but she is living right in the middle between Auburn and Alabama at Jacksonville State University in Alabama. So if you have any interest in college football, you know how complicated life is in this moment for somebody. Uh, she is the author of the book we're talking about, Sisterhood of the Lost Cause, Confederate Widows in the New South from LSU Press. Actually, by the way, a really nice picture that you picked too. I really like that.
Thank you.
Nice book. So you I don't often read the acknowledgement, but I read through yours, and there was a very interesting line that said, I emailed Rand and was like, manuscript is finally done 20 years later. So I think there's a story there.
Well, the story's not really as fascinating as you might expect, but the book is, it's based on my dissertation. That's the foundation for the book. And I, when I finished my graduate degree and I went to Jacksonville, I revised it and I sent it to Rand and he sent it to readers and they came back with comments. And, I started addressing some of those comments. And then shortly thereafter, I started a family. And
Hmm.
my teaching load at Jacksonville State is a very heavy teaching load. And then I had two small children. And I chose to devote my time primarily to my children, and the rest of
Mhm.
the time was devoted to teaching. And so I couldn't really spend as much time on the book as I needed to. And so instead, I did little small projects, articles
Hmm.
and papers like conferences, and kind of got off track. For those of you who are familiar with Anniston, Alabama, which is where I actually live. It's about 20 minutes from Jacksonville. It has a storied past within the civil rights movement. And when I first moved here, it was kind of shocking that there was very little recognition of its place
Hmm.
in the civil rights movement. There was nothing about the bus burning, no historical marker, nothing. I mean, there was no acknowledgement
Hmm.
whatsoever. And so, I started doing some research on that and ended up co-writing an essay for a book that was edited by Karen Cox called Destination Dixie, which was about historical tourism. And that situation has since changed. Of course, now we have the Freedom Riders National Monument Park, which
Hmm.
was designated by Obama. So that's pretty awesome. But anyway, I started doing those kinds of things that I could do, and the
Hmm.
book kind of took a back seat. And ultimately, it was my father's passing in 2022 that really kind of launched me back into the book. And I don't know if it was, that I wanted to finish it for him, or if it was that my mother had become a widow, and so her grief kind of started to resonate with
Hmm.
me. And so that kind of drove me back to the
Hmm.
Confederate Widows. But I just kind of dove back in, and had a renewed kind of desire to finish it, and so I did, and sent it to Rand. And the funny part of it was is that the thing that had kind of prevented me from finishing it all those years, the thing that required so much work, I actually ended up cutting in the final edit. It was an entire chapter. I cut the whole thing out to meet the page
Oh,
requirement.
I know Rand loves cutting, but I mean that's brutal.
Yeah. When I sent it, he wrote back immediately, and he was like, "This is way over the word limit."
Oh.
And so that last chapter, I just ended up cutting the whole thing. So
Mm.
I mean, that's it's kind of funny, but I think that's probably going to be the seed kernel for the next project. So I mean, I guess there's that. But
Well, I guess I'm
he's
kind
a
of lucky
fantastic
now.
editor. I mean, he was completely he wasn't surprised at all. He was like, "Oh, that's great. I'll send it back out to the readers."
Yeah.
I mean, there was no chastisement or anything. It's like, great, good to have it.
Right.
No,
No.
LSU Press has been fantastic. Anyone who's looking at publishing, I highly recommend them. Um, they've just been
Hmm.
fantastic.
Yes. No, I good experiences overall with for my two books. So, but yeah, now I'm kind of glad that he did just said no pictures to our books. I was like, I think we were 50,000 over.
Yeah.
Like, whew, boy, um, we would probably fought for it. So, so you, it's kind of interesting that you're saying like your mother, the widowhood of your mother kind of stimulated you to keep going back to the project. But what started in grad school actually, Zan, that you kind of were like, ooh, I want to look at, and this is 20 years ago, so I kind of this is this is around the time when Karen Cox's Dixie's Daughters came out, I would assume, right? I'm
Well,
blanking
it's a
on the
little
exact
before it.
publication date.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was a little before it. I remember, in fact, when I was at Georgia, I remember going to the Southern as a graduate student and hearing her give a paper on the
Mm,
UDC, which I assume was part of what was her dissertation and then became 60 Daughters.
right.
Um, my work on Confederate Widows began actually not at Georgia but at the University of Richmond.
Mm,
At the University of Richmond, I took a class. It was a Civil War seminar with Bob Kinzer, and he was very much into quantitative methodology. And so what he had us do, because of course we're there in Richmond, so we have the archives, Virginia Archives, right down the road,
mhm,
and the Confederate Archives right there. And so he wanted us to choose a county, and then choose from a county, choose a regiment, and trace that
mm,
regiment's history through the course of the war,
okay.
and write a paper on it using
Right.
quantitative methodology. And so in the course of writing that paper for that class, I found these widows, and I remember writing in the
Hmm.
paper, what happened to them. And so then
Right.
he became my thesis advisor, and he said, I think you should run with that, and
Mm,
you should write about widows. And so I did what was largely a quantitative focused thesis on Confederate widowhood in a county in Virginia. And then when I went to
mm,
Georgia, it just expanded from there to be more than that quantitative focus, looking at different aspects of widowhood, getting into diaries and stuff like that. I mean, the thesis, I didn't look at any diaries. I didn't look at, it was all it was census driven and tax records driven and kind of constructing a story of widowhood based on those very
mhm.
dry sources. So it
Yeah, I was
started.
just gonna say, I'm glad you jettisoned some of that quantitative and made it more qualitative.
I mean, it's really, those kinds of sources and and building that story. I mean, I think it has a place, and it can add some
Hmm.
kind of meat and bones. But the fun stuff is clearly when you find those diaries, right, and you find letters,
Right.
and you can see what women are saying and how they're experiencing their widowhood. I mean, that's
Hmm.
the fun stuff, right? I mean, that's what people want to
Right.
read. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I'm glad that I did not stick with just that, meat of the census and tax records and wills. Um, I'm glad it expanded once I got to Georgia. I am.
Yeah.
And to the
Um,
literature as well. I mean, the literature
mhm,
started at Georgia as well when I took an English class there as part of my class schedule. And, just the way people wrote about widows, I think is kind of fascinating. Um,
mhm,
so it just, I don't, for me, it just kind of added to the story. So.
right. Yeah, and I kind of that's actually a great segue because I was thinking in terms of like how some of your work correlates to recent scholarship like Karen Cox's Dixie's Daughters or Adam Donby's Paul's Cause, where he also talks a lot about veterans and sort of the pensions that you're talking about. So, like, one of the benefits, I suppose, that you have is sort of to see between your dissertation finishing and the book coming out, there's been a lot of work being done and publications being done. So, how did that influence your thinking about this period? Did you kind of feel like, oh man, why did Dombey write this book? I'm doing that. You should have stopped that.
No, I mean, I think it really, it broadened the story. I mean, his work,
Mhm,
right? This idea of falsifying records, right? Making up this
mhm.
history, right? Of oh, I served, so therefore I should get this pension. I mean,
Right.
first of all, he's correct. It's very easy. I mean, if you compare, for example, how you got a pension in the Union and how you got a pension, a Confederate pension, I mean, you had to have evidence to get a pension
Mhm.
in the Union system. In the Confederate system, you basically just had to have somebody vouch for you and say, "Oh yeah,
Yeah.
he served,"
You're correct.
and that was it. And that's something that
Mhm,
I addressed in the book as well. That it was also, if you, and this is particularly true of widows, is that if you
mhm,
were not acceptable, like you were doing something that was unacceptable, like cohabiting with someone, right? It was a way to
mhm.
deny you, right? Well, you're not
Right.
good enough. You're not behaving the way you're supposed to be behaving, so we're not going to give you a pension. And so nobody would vouch for you, and so you didn't get your pension as a result. So it was a tool of manipulation, and in Dombey's case, it was a tool of buttressing white supremacy. But
Mhm,
these widows are kind of playing the same role that those men who didn't actually serve but yet filed for a pension they're playing, right? They're just a part of that lie. So to get the pension, right, they have to stay unmarried, and
mhm,
by staying unmarried, they become these women who are forever mourning, right, for their lost
mhm,
love, right? And then even as they expand pensions for these women who marry men who didn't die during the war, they might have died 20
mhm,
years after the war. Well, you know, from our definitions, they really aren't Confederate widows, right? They're not war
mhm.
widows, but yet
Right.
they're being defined the same way as a woman who lost her husband in the war because it serves the
Mhm,
purpose of the lost cause. It serves the purpose of white supremacy. And so they're lumping them into that same group and saying, "Oh yeah, she's a Confederate widow," right? And so it's that same idea. So
mhm,
Dombey's work and my work very much, I think, they inform each other. And
mhm,
the same thing with Cox's work from the UDC. I mean, I cite her throughout the book.
mhm,
Her work on the UDC was formative for me.
mhm,
Um, her she's fantastic. First of all,
mhm,
her most recent book. Well, I guess I don't know if it's her most recent book. It just came out in the second edition, the one No Common Ground about Confederate
mhm,
monuments. I actually assigned that in my Civil War seminar. But her work in all of that is just it's so important in terms of teaching the lost cause and that separation of memory from history. And
mhm,
I'd like to think that that my work is a contribution to that as well. That these widows are very much a function of the lost cause and the creation of memory,
Mhm.
not so much of actual history, but of so much of um, what lost causers are trying to say about the Civil War and elevating these women to the
I mean, you already raised like half the questions that on topics I want to talk about with this because like there's so many interesting facets to this to the notion of widowhood and like what really stood out I felt was like how you have this old perception that women should be married, right? And then you get
right.
this other perception that these have to be manless women as I love that terminology by the way. These they have to
Thank
be
you.
manless women because they otherwise can be these symbols of sacrifice and suffering and mourning that we need for the lost cause. So it seemed like an internal contradiction almost that you had to break with tradition to be what they wanted you to be.
Yes, I mean it very much is, and part of that is just the recognition that so many of them can't get married, right? I mean, so many men
Mhm.
died that you do have that skewed gender ratio, and so for a
Which
lot
was
of the women
fascinating.
there,
We should talk about that too.
yeah, I mean it just wasn't possible for a lot of these women, and a lot of these women um, weren't attractive marital partners because
Mhm.
didn't they weren't they hadn't inherited property or they were older,
Mhm.
and so a younger woman who didn't have baggage like children and no wealth, so they just weren't
Mhm.
the biggest catch on the market, if you will. Yeah, so their chances of getting married were lower than an 18-year-old who had never been married kind of thing. But it's a catch 22 for them, right? I mean, they
Mhm.
only get the pension if they stay unmarried, but yet the pension is not enough for them to be comfortable, really. I mean, if you think about like how much money they got as a widow versus how much the soldier got for his
Mhm.
service, they're getting significantly less in most states.
Mhm.
There were only a couple of states that gave a widow the same amount as a soldier, as if to say, we don't want you to be comfortable as a manless woman because you're supposed to be married. But we're only going to give you this money if you are unmarried, but we don't
Mhm.
like it. you know? But then they're all the time, at the same time, when they talk about these pensions, they're celebrating these women. Bravo for you for being, so gracious in your sacrifice and lauding them for their
Mhm.
willingness to give up their
Right.
loved one for the cause. And so it's so contradictory.
Yeah, and it also like the I also something that I enjoyed and maybe something that we should maybe talk about here is that um the the process like I love how you call it the art of dying,
Well,
right?
that's not
Like
actually my phrase,
there's a
though.
whole process behind all of this that you have to follow, and
Yeah,
um, the war makes it impossible on some level to do.
it does very much so. And I mean, Drew Faust's Republic of Suffering was very
Mhm.
informative, for that. But and I guess to some extent, again, I go back to my mother, and of course she's in the modern period. This is 2022,
Mhm.
and so there aren't all these strictures on what women are supposed to do. Right? I mean, yes, you wear black to the funeral, but it's not like you have to wear black every day, and it's not like you have to shut yourself up in the house and you can't go out in public and all of this. But there were, even now in 2022, she's in her 80s, and she, there were things that she would say, like I'd say, well, are you going to
Mhm.
go and have lunch with your friends? Oh, I no, I'm not going to do that. Right? Things that she found not appropriate at the time. It was too
Mhm.
soon, or and so even now there are these ideas about what's appropriate and what's not
Mhm.
appropriate. so in the context of those years of the war, these women couldn't abide by all of those
mm,
rules and regulations because you know, children had to be fed, right? They
mhm,
had to put food on the table, and they had to, deal with things as the only provider at that point.
mhm,
And in terms of getting the black clothing, I mean, in the book, I talk about some of the costs for black cloth and the struggle to get that, and
mhm,
we can kind of poo-poo it and say, well, it's not that important, but in a community where you're looking for other people to acknowledge your loss, you have to
mhm.
signal to them that you
Right.
lost, right? And the way to do that
Mhm,
is by dressing the part. And if you can't
mhm,
dress the part, then how do you signal to others that you lost? And you know, it's an important thing, and it's part of that process. And that process is important for people to kind of move through the steps of grief. And so,
mhm,
in women's diaries during the war and after the war, they're constantly kind of referring to this feeling that they're stuck, like that they never
mhm,
really got to grieve right, you know,
mhm,
and that they don't have a grave to go to, and they didn't get to see their loved one on their deathbed, and then it's not right in their minds, like
mhm,
there's no closure, to use that kind of
mhm.
modern phrase that we do.
And I kind of feel like that's especially with the Civil War. I mean, probably shouldn't say it, but it feels like for the US at least, it's especially a Civil War issue because so many of the veterans die, or so many soldiers die in quote unquote far off places for this time, right? Like if you're from
Right.
central Alabama and your son or husband is dies at Chancellorsville or even in Gettysburg, that's a long trip.
Yeah.
Or like recovering a body, that's just impossible to a large degree.
Yeah. I mean, the movement after the war to recover bodies, it's not
Mm,
surprising that movement by the Ladies Memorial Association, is largely led by widows and by women.
mhm,
I mean,
right,
it's not surprising that that's who's kind of leading the charge to do that. And and they do recover some, but they're not recovering them, and then knocking on someone's door and saying, "Hey, I've got your husband's body," right? They're just kind of bringing them back to the states, and
right,
putting them in the states where they belong, perhaps. And so, even let's say you were a widow in from Asheville, North Carolina. Maybe your
mm,
husband's body got moved back to Raleigh and interred in Oakwood Cemetery. That's still a pretty
it's
long
still
journey
yeah,
for
yeah,
you to make on a fairly regular basis.
uh-huh,
And so and the cost, if you wanted to try and move his body back to where you were, is
mhm,
going to be very large, and not
right,
everybody can afford that. Obviously, most people can't afford that.
right, and how many unknown do we have too, right? Like, if you go
Right.
to, like, Civil War battlefields and you go through the cemetery, and how many times is it just unknown, and, like,
Right.
who knows who's down there, and that makes it even harder for these communities to to grieve.
Right. I mean, it's hard to kind of reconcile in your brain,
Mm,
the loss if you haven't actually seen that body or haven't seen, you know what I mean?
mhm,
Um,
right,
and so for a lot of them, they kind of stuck in that place of denial that they won't
mhm,
recognize it. Um,
right,
and you see that in their diaries and letters to people that they kind of refuse to accept. Sometimes
mhm,
for a pretty significant amount of time, they refuse to accept that it's true.
mm. Yeah, and it it was interesting too of, like, kind of maybe talk a little about sources because you're using a lot of diaries and letters, and it was interesting how you had, like, instances where the death occurs and the diary entry stop, or a person starts on purpose a diary, and like how does did you kind of see any patterns in like did this like was it like younger women that decided to stop the diary or older women that like or was it just sort of an individual basis where a person was like, I'm gonna start writing now to figure out how to deal with my grief?
Well, I think the pattern is that there wasn't a pattern.
Fair enough.
I mean, so somebody who maybe kept a diary before their husband's death might stop writing in a diary, either for
Mm,
a period of time or completely. And then somebody who had never written a diary might start writing in a diary as a way to kind of cope. And so, there's no real kind of rhyme or reason. And from
mm,
what I read, it just some of the sources that I read, because I looked at like modern psychology to try and understand
mhm,
processing of grief, and that was one of the things that modern psychologists say is that people process things differently, and so you might start doing something you'd never done before, or you might give up
mhm,
something that you had always done. And so in that sense it does make sense that somebody who had always
mm,
written in a diary would suddenly stop because they no longer found
mm,
joy in it, or the process itself simply made them think too much about their grief, and so they didn't want to deal with it. And then, on the other hand, somebody who had never written in a diary might choose to do
mm,
so because they found it cathartic.
mm.
And so to me that made sense. And
Yeah.
so that's why I say the pattern is that there's no pattern. It was more of an individual thing. It just varied by person. And then, of course,
Right then,
you also have so many women who are illiterate, and so we don't have
mm,
sources for them. We don't know what they did. We can only extrapolate based on those who did leave behind sources.
mm. Oh, that actually leads me over to the we in our email correspondence. I had a little note that was primarily for me with regard to like a question I wanted to ask you. So I guess first of all, how like is there a process like paperwork that you have to go through to get a pension in the southern states? Sort of similar to what you have in like the north, where you have to actually file paperwork to get money out of the U.S. government to get a pension.
Yes, so there was an application form that you had to fill out, and it varied by state, but they all looked fairly similar. Um, you filled it out. You put your name, if you were widowed, so you put your name. Your husband's name went on there. You had to identify, what his regiment or company was. You had to identify the name of
Mhm,
two people who could testify about, his service. And then if he died during the war, you had to say when, I think, and where.
mhm,
But some of these applications were pretty vague, and because they didn't necessarily know, and they're filling them
mhm,
out. I mean, the pension system doesn't really come about until the late 19th century, and so for some of these
mhm.
women, that's a good 20 years after the
Right.
death, right? And so,
Mhm.
I don't know about you, but my memory is not so great 20 years after the fact. I mean, I can't remember everything. And so, they're just kind of, putting stuff out there, and then somebody will
Mhm,
attest to it for them, and then it's approved or it's denied. And in some cases, you could, they'll mark it with an X, so you can tell they didn't actually fill it out. They're just giving the information verbally, and then they sign it with the X, and someone else wrote it down.
mhm,
But it's a pretty loose process.
mm,
So it's not surprising to me at all that there's fraud. And I didn't investigate that. I mean, there's probably a good number of Confederate widows who,
mm.
maybe didn't deserve their pension. I don't know. Maybe that could be, yeah,
Well, I
but
guess we could talk about that in a minute of like how deserving is that 20-year-old that marries the old 80-year-old veteran, right? Like,
right.
mm, but the reason why I kind of ask about it is that I recently had I'm trying to remember his name here, Damien Shields on, who wrote a recent book Green and Blue, where he looks at Irish Americans and
Okay.
their service in the Civil War, and he went through the US pension files and used them to kind of give voice to these lower class individuals through the voice of these pension files and kind of trying to understand where did they come from? Why did they engage in this? What motivated them to go to war? What were the experiences? So I kind of was curious if the Confederate pension files would offer us a similar opportunity to understand maybe classes that otherwise wouldn't be as easily accessible, but I guess not.
No, they don't have that much information in it. I mean, the
Mm,
widows. The other thing I forgot to mention about the application is they would have also said when they got married,
mm,
because that's one of the things about the widows' pensions is that when you had to have married your husband by
mm,
changed over time. So at first you had to have married him before or during the war, and then it changed as time went by, and you could marry him by 1870 or by 1875, so on and so forth. Um, and so they had a place for that on there as well. But there,
mm,
there was very little exposition on
mm,
these forms at all. I mean, I think you had to attest that you didn't have any property, and that was it.
mm,
But it was pretty much a check this box if you have no property kind of thing. It wasn't you didn't have to like list your assets or anything like that.
oh, man, the fraud opportunities are endless with that.
Yeah. I mean, a good example might be like Mariana Jackson, Stonewall Jackson's widow. She, at one point, the North Carolina legislature tried to award her a pension. She did not
Mm,
apply, but they tried to give her one, and
mm,
she said no. It should go to somebody who doesn't have any property because I have
mm,
property.
okay.
um, which she did struggle some financially at various times during her life, but she turned that pension down, and
Mm.
said it should go to somebody who doesn't have any property. So take that for what you will.
I was gonna say there's maybe one good thing that came out of Jackson. Oh my. Um, but kind of thinking of like the individuals and property and pensions, it also reminded me of that story of the plantation owner in Georgia in your book, and it's her and I think it's 4 or 5 daughters, and the
Oh,
husband dies. It was fascinating of like, so she's just like they're just all saying, "We're not marrying at all,
yeah,
and we're just running the plantation as a group of 5 women." Like,
yeah,
that just so, like, in many ways blows all the stereotypes, right, of this period.
yeah. And I mean, they were fascinating, and I couldn't find a whole lot about them other
Mm,
than that little bit. And so, and I think I said in the book that it's unclear whether or not they, didn't marry because
mm,
nobody asked or because they, rejected any suitors.
mm,
So either one could be possible. Um, but personally, I like to think that, they chose to just
mhm,
be their little unit, of
right.
five sisters and the mother, and that they were going to do it on their own. That's my preference.
Well, if there's no record, your guess is as good as anyone else's.
Since we don't know.
Yeah, but it is sort of this dilemma of, like, what do you do? Your husband is gone, you have to manage a property, and I think that's, like, there's sort of the challenge of, like, "Oh, I have this huge plantation that I now need to run myself, and the slaves are all gonna run away pretty soon because of emancipation, or I'm in already big poverty because we weren't really well off, and there's nothing like how am I supposed to survive with my kids? Yeah, like
Yeah.
there's so much extreme in there, and so many different perspectives potentially.
Yeah, and it did vary tremendously. And I mean, that's where, the quantitative stuff came in.
Mhm.
The women who didn't leave diaries because they were illiterate,
Right.
and they didn't have grand plantations and such. I mean, the way you find them, right, is through census records and that's those
Mhm.
kinds of things because they don't really show up any other way.
Mhm.
But they do show up as heads of households in census records.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
you can kind of trace them that way. And so, I use those drier sources in terms of finding those women. Um, and then filled in, for the wealthier women with their diaries and such. But to go back to the Jackson family that didn't, the daughters that didn't marry. I mean, to my recollection, that they didn't have a large plantation. It was just, like they were yeomen. It was just a farm, and I think her name was Marjorie, if I remember correctly. She just she they just made the farm work, which
Mhm.
is the best really that any of these widows who were able to inherit a farm were
Mhm.
able to do. And the fact that her daughters were able to work the farm with her, uh,
Yeah.
I mean, it is surprising. Um, that she was able to make a go of it that way because so many of them were not, right? So many of these women who were not able to remarry ended up dependent on someone
Mhm.
else, on a male family member, a brother, on an in-law, on an adult
Mhm.
child, and they had to move in with them, and so they lost that privilege of being a head of household and had to become dependent on someone else, and that didn't happen for the Jacksons, and so um, big credit goes to them for being able to do that. And I think I say in the book and maybe I didn't actually say this in the book, but there was no like secret recipe. It just kind
Mhm.
of depended. Sometimes it was just luck.
Yeah.
Whether or not a woman was able to make a go of it and make a
Mhm.
success. Sometimes it was that she did inherit something. I mean, there's one woman I remember talking about, Julietta Chile, who her husband, when he wrote his will, he didn't designate everything as a
Mhm.
life estate,
Mhm.
right? So that was his error,
Mhm.
and so she inherited everything, and then she ran with it, right? And she was able to accumulate more property and
Mhm.
do quite well for herself. But not everybody had that experience, right? And so if you're only inheriting a dower, which is just a third, and you only get it at the life estate, and then you have depressed property values, and then you have the probate process, you can understand why so many of these women were in such dire circumstances that when the pensions came around 20 years after the war, and they're offering even the small amount that they're offering, that they're going to jump on that chance to, to get that little bit of money. I mean, we're talking a really small amount of money, particularly compared to
Mhm.
what the union was
Mhm.
offering to their widows. Um, but yet, even that small amount of money was
Mhm.
going to be beneficial to them.
And before we get into some of the monetary side, because that I think is fascinating too. I kind of told you some of the stories that really stood out to me with sort of different women. But when you were you did the research, you spent years learning about all these women. Who stood out to you the most? Who did you find the most fascinating?
Oh, I hate to play favorites.
Well,
Um,
I'm pretty sure your kids know that you have a favorite.
Julietta Chile is one of my favorites, I will admit,
Mhm.
and she's been with me since my thesis at Richmond.
Ooh.
She was a Brunswick County widow that I discovered in those dry sources of the census and the
Mm.
tax records. So she's one of my favorites. Another one of my favorites is actually someone who, is maybe surprising, but her name is Laura Comer. She was from Georgia, and she was a wealthy woman, and she hated her husband. And she
Oh, was
talked
that the
about,
one where she was, like, kind of acting like, "Oh, yeah, he's dead." No, like I'm going to go through the process of grieving, but I really am
Yes,
happy that he's gone. Oh yeah, I remember
yes,
that. That
that's
was a
her.
great one.
Yeah. So she talks in her diary before he goes to war, before he dies. She, talks about how he's horrible. He's horrible to her, and she can't stand him, and he torments her, and she wishes that she was rid of him, and all this. And then when he dies, she's like, "Oh, okay." And then when she's talking about her grieving process, she's like, "Yeah, so I put on black and I bought the gravestone and it's okay." And she just, but her diary after he dies, the tone of it just changes completely. She's like, "Thank God for this beautiful day." I mean, it's just, I don't know. It made me laugh. But so she's one of my favorites for that because she's just so honest and authentic. Um, so she's one of my favorites, and I do like the Jacksons because I find them resilient. Um, and beyond those
Mm,
three, I don't. I think those are my only favorites, honestly.
okay. Yeah, I did like her. She was she was something. She was something. Like, so, but I would assume that, like, I mean, as much as it sort of seems like, and you're not saying it's not exceptional because you do have women that are probably not really happy and actually are
Right,
relieved, let's say, that their husbands died because in an age of where you can't really divorce, it's what do you do? Um,
right.
so it is sort of nice that you have one voice that kind of gives you the sense of like, oh, yeah, there are people that actually feels this way.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's really easy to kind of romanticize these
Hmm.
widows, right? And that's
Right.
exactly what the Lost Cause did, right? Talking about their willing sacrifice and how much they continued to love and mourn these men who
Hmm.
died 20 and 30 and 40 years before, as evidenced by the fact that they don't remarry, right? Not acknowledging the fact that maybe they didn't remarry because there was no one for them to remarry. Instead, chalking it up to, oh, it's because they're forever mourning for them. So
Hmm.
it's really easy to kind of fall into that trap. And the reality is that that's, a trap, right? And that not all marriages were happy. And some of these women
Hmm.
were probably, relieved and maybe
Hmm.
even gleeful when their
Yeah.
husbands were gone, as, I think is evidenced by Laura Comer. And
Hmm.
even if you put that aside, the women who didn't remarry, I don't think we can just say it's because they were so mournful for 20, 30, and 40 years. They probably didn't remarry for very practical reasons, either because
Hmm.
they inherited property and they wanted to keep control of it, or
Yeah.
they didn't inherit property and so nobody wanted to marry them, and there just wasn't an attractive spouse for them to marry.
Hmm.
Uh, and not attractive in like a beauty kind of way, but attractive in a practical kind of way.
Financial.
Right.
Yeah. And so I want to, of course, we still have the literature and the monumentation as well ahead of us. So you have a lot in your book. That's the crazy part. You have a lot in those 250 odd pages. Um, so I briefly though want to talk about, because one of the numbers that stood out to me was, I think it was the state of Georgia, of how much Georgia during the war spent on relief to destitute soldiers, especially dead soldiers' families. That was
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, that's, Confederate money, so it's inflated and all of that. Yeah, it's fairly worthless. But still, yes, it was an enormous amount of money. And, the verbiage that the politicians used when they talked about it, I think, really kind of hit home with why they did that. I mean,
Mm,
um, Joe Brown, as governor, was very much committed to this notion of states' rights and of supporting his
mm,
soldiers, right, and so
right.
thus his soldiers' families, and
Mhm,
um, I think that's evidenced by the amount of money that they spent,
mhm,
and the amount of effort that they put into trying to help those families. Um, the fact that it didn't work, I suppose, is neither here nor there, really. I mean, it's easy to say, oh well, it didn't do any good. But you have to step back, right, and look at how much money they put in. And so it's the same thing with the pension system, right? It's easy to say, well, they didn't spend nearly as much money as the union pensions did. Well, that's true, but they did so at extreme
Mm.
cost to the
Right.
states. I mean,
Hmm.
they weren't really in a position to spend that money, and they spent it when they could have been spending it on roads, on schools,
Education.
on all
Yeah.
sorts of things that they should have been spending it on, and
Yeah.
instead they spent it on these pension systems that ballooned. When
Mhm.
they started expanding it and basically letting everybody and their dog who was in any way associated with the Confederate cause get a pension.
Well, now, let's be fair to the dogs. I mean, there might have been an ancestor in their family tree that was a mascot on a unit.
Maybe so.
I mean, I have two southern dogs that made love journeys. I would
Well,
hope that
being a Georgia fan, there are the Bulldogs. So,
there you go. Uh, but in part, the lead, the question was leading to a point that I was thinking in terms too of like it feels odd on some level that the very conservative section of the country decides to so much break with 19th century tradition of taking care of people, doing quote unquote welfare.
yeah. But I think that, part of that is what Liam White identified as this patriarchal contract, right?
Hmm.
Is that when the state takes away the husband, then they take on that responsibility for the wives and the families. And so, for the soldiers who have been left, they're expecting the state to take care of their family. And once they've done that, they're kind of wedded to it, or they're going to wind up with even more desertions and even more men who are unwilling to go if they can't trust that the state is going to make sure that their family is taken care of. And it's part of that expectation on their part.
Do you feel like just I don't know the answer to this, maybe you do or not. Do you feel like it was
Maybe.
also the magnitude of this conflict? Because we didn't really do a lot for widows in, say, the Mexican War or like the Native American struggles before, but this was different because it was so devastatingly huge, especially after you get to like Shiloh and Antietam and those massive slugfests, really.
Yeah. I mean, I think so, but I think also just the magnitude in terms of the impact on the Southern home front. I
Mm,
mean, very quickly the situation degenerated in the South in terms of suffering,
mhm,
and that was so apparent
mm,
that to not do anything, I think the war would have ended. I think
mhm.
significantly earlier had they not tried to do anything, because I think men would have en masse deserted. I
Right.
mean, you already saw the impact as women started writing letters saying,
Mhm,
we're suffering. And you have the bread riots in '63. I mean, imagine if states had done nothing.
mhm.
I mean, you had these letters and you had the bread riots in '63, and that was with states doing something. So
Right.
imagine if they had done nothing, then those things would have occurred probably significantly earlier, and then you would have had that internal revolt earlier rather than when they occurred. So I think that it behooved those politicians to do something because of that, and it supported their argument, right? That
Mm.
they were, you know, for their people and for their states' rights to do that.
Oh, yes, there comes the lost cause again.
Right, right.
Um, but before we get to lost cause, I wanna talk about literature because it seemed, correct me if I was wrong in reading that it seemed like you really enjoyed writing that chapter on literature and poetry.
I did, I did. I
Uh,
mean, it was, it was inspired by the class that I took on literature, which I didn't look
mm,
at any of those authors actually in that class. But that the class was on Southern literature, and I remember
And
thinking,
and none of them popped up?
no. I mean, it was because it was modern. It was modern.
Mm,
Actually, Grace King did. Grace King did make an appearance early in the class, but it was more focused towards modern Southern literature. But I remember thinking, huh, I wonder, what would happen if I started looking at some prominent
mhm.
authors. And so I did, and of
So
course,
what let's think about, like, what was the process of it? Because you have I didn't count, but you had what, like 20, 30 poems that you explored? And, like, did you kind of like already knew this was the ones you wanted, or did you kind of in the process of like, oh, I found one, then I found another one, and there's a similar theme. Let me see if there's a third. Like, how did you do that? And, like, because you found, like, I was impressed, like these themes throughout different poetry.
thank you. So the poetry, I found these. The poetry was actually inspired by widows themselves.
Okay.
So when I was doing my research in collections of diaries and letters and stuff, I found that it was really striking how many of these women would cut out poems from
Hmm.
newspapers and keep
Okay.
them in. I mean, they called them various things, but they were essentially scrapbooks.
Yeah.
I mean, they called them commonplace books and all sorts of
Hmm.
different things, but they were scrapbooks. And so I'd see like the same poems in
Hmm.
these books, and so they were being published in newspapers, and these women would cut them out. And so I
Hmm.
started thinking, okay, well, these poems must be resonating
Right.
with these women. So then I started thinking, okay, well, let me look at these poems, and so then I started looking for the poems in their published form. And so then
Hmm.
I found these collections of poems that were published um, to raise money for the Lost
Hmm.
Cause. And you see the same poems in these same
Hmm.
collections, right? They make return appearances. And
Hmm.
so I think, okay, this makes sense that you have these same poems. And so then I identified those themes within those different poems within those different collections as a result of that. So it was really, it started with the widows themselves, and then it kind of grew from there.
Right. And it seemed very gendered in that the man very heavily bought into the paternalistic
You know,
arguments.
the way that men and women wrote poetry was very different. The way they
Mm,
imagined um, widowhood was
mm,
and sacrifice. It was so different. It was just kind of um, I don't want to say surprising, but it was just so glaring, really,
mm,
because it was so very different. The way that men very much, like you said, they bought into this
mm,
idea of willing sacrifice and
right,
these women graciously giving up their love on the altar of the cause. I mean, the language that they chose to
yeah,
use was so strikingly different from the way women
mm,
talked about grief in these poems.
yeah.
It was very striking.
It seemed divorced from the realities
Oh,
that
very much so.
you would undergo during this, right? And it's more strange, I feel like, because and you kind of try and quantify it a little bit with numbers, but it's like everywhere you had Confederate widows, everywhere there was the scars of war visible. To kind of ignore that and ignore that suffering as you write poetry seems like almost like, what reality do you live in?
Yeah. I think for the men, it was almost like they were writing poetry in this kind of prescriptive way.
Mm,
Like they're trying to prescribe how the women should
mm,
behave and how the widows
yeah,
should behave. Whereas the women who are writing the poetry are writing it in a more descriptive way, right?
mhm,
So they're writing what they're describing what they're seeing in terms of widows'
mm,
behavior and widows' grief, whereas men are trying to prescribe how they should be doing it based on the lost cause and based on
mm.
their ideas of what's appropriate in terms of widows' behaviors and how they should be respecting the cause and such.
So, who was your favorite poet?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure I picked a favorite poet.
Hmm,
Yeah, I don't think I picked a favorite poet.
all right,
They all, yeah, I don't know. The poetry, I mean,
fair
I
enough.
will say this in terms of the poetry and literature, my favorite author was Grace King.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, the poetry, none of them were really my favorite, but
Hmm,
I do like Grace King. Um,
okay.
and I think she's an interesting because I think she really reflects that divide, and that's why I
Hmm,
included her. I mean, she's very different from Augusta Evans,
hmm,
Page, and Dixon, and because she's more of a child of the
hmm,
war than she is an adult, right? And so
hmm,
her perspective on it is very different, I think,
right,
and maybe that's why I appreciate what she had to write
hmm.
in a different kind of way.
Yeah, I was since you mentioned these three already too. Like, I was very happy to see Evans in there. And I want to say I gave my students that book when I taught the American Civil War class.
Really? How did that go
Yeah,
over?
I don't remember. Like, it's a few years now, but I kind of was like I wanted to give them like a woman author. I don't.
Yeah.
I can't remember. Like, they got some interesting stuff.
Yeah, she's an interesting author. I mean, she likes her words.
Mhm.
Let's put it that way.
That's a
She likes
diplomatic way of phrasing things.
she likes to display her intelligence and
Mm.
her the fact that she's well read in Greek history.
I still have like that. What is it? Series of history books from Cunningham, I think, downstairs, where there's still like the Greek like the old 50s books that like put the actual actual language into, and you're like, I have no idea what those Greek symbols even
Yeah,
mean. Why are they here?
exactly.
Um, but I think that with Nelson and Dixon too, you have this very interesting situation that they are Southern authors, they are knowing the environment, and they too sort of delegate widows sort of to the sides of the story.
Yeah.
And it's like it seems like considering how prominent they must have been, it seems almost counter to the realities of the period. Maybe intentional. You tell me.
I think it was intentional. I mean, I think um, for both of those authors, I think women as characters, they're really just window dressing.
Mm,
Even their main characters, right, who are female, they're
right.
just window dressing, right? They're always acted upon. They're never acting
Hmm.
themselves, and
Right.
so it makes sense to me that widows would not be their main characters. I mean, in order for their male characters to be these heroes, they need to have the Southern Belle character, right? And a widow is not a Southern Belle character, right? So, um, they're gonna put widows in their stories,
Right.
um, but they're just kind of there, smattered around as decoration, essentially,
Mm,
an acknowledgement that there are Confederate widows around, an acknowledgement that the war is the context, but they're not really varying from that tried and true formula that makes sense for them, which is
mm,
male as hero, male as actor, female as acted upon.
right. It seems like again, it seems like a very conservative way fitting the cells
Right.
in that the literature. Was there anything where you kind of were like hoping for something different, or was this sort of like? I mean, you said you had a literature course before this on the Southern literature. Was it sort of like something where you're like going in and expecting like, yep, widows don't matter.
know if I was expecting anything really different. I do remember when I read Augusta Jane Evans. Um, After I read Macaria, I expected her to kind of keep that theme up,
Mm,
um, and she didn't really, and so that
right.
was disappointing. Um,
Mm,
that was, I think, that was my biggest disappointment, was that I kind of thought, okay, she's gonna embrace this idea of single womanhood and
mm,
usefulness, as she liked to use that phrase, and she's going to really go with it. And
mm,
then the books that came after, she doesn't really do that.
mm,
She kind of reverts back. And so I
right.
think, that book is really just a product of her experience during the war, and her fear that
Mm,
she wasn't going to get married. Um, and in fact, she did, she married late in life, particularly for a
well,
Southern woman.
I guess sort of the question that grows out of it is sort of like that you even have today, right? Of like, if I want to sell a book, I have to write a certain
Yeah.
way, I have to meet certain expectations, and maybe that's sort of something that she was told. Like, you want to
Yeah.
sell and get another publishing contract, you better write this way.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, readers, her fans kind of cut her
Mhm,
some slack
right.
because of the topic of that book.
Mhm,
But, I remember reading one, I think it was, I want to say it was Ella Gertrude Clanton Thomas, who in her diary said that she did not like the book
mhm,
because the heroines didn't get married. And
right.
that's just one person, right, who wrote that in her diary. That's just one person. But, um, there were reviewers who said that it was an unnatural ending. And so I think some people kind of cut her some slack because of the context of the war, but I think you're right that, you know, the formula was not the formula that was acceptable. The acceptable formula was to be useful and then get married, right?
Mhm, right.
And so that's the formula she went back to, was to be useful and then get married eventually.
Well,
So
that's like still the case, right? When you look at any Hollywood movie that comes out, it's like if there's no happy ending, then how dare you have wasted my 2 hours of time?
right, right, exactly.
Unless there's a major cliffhanger and you're gonna sell me another 2-hour movie 2 years down the road.
Right.
Um, okay. We're still living in that sort of era or that
I think so, yeah, I think
attitude.
you're right.
Um, so let's turn to the sort of the last 2 chapters of yours deal with monuments, and
Yeah.
we already talked quite extensively about pensions, but I always find the monument side really interesting, and in your case, you really have the ability to explore the evolution of the memory culture in the South from the Ladies Memorial Associations to the UDC. So, which stage do you feel was the most important for widows? Where were they most influential in, within Southern society?
I think, they played a role in both, really.
Mhm,
I think you see them active in the Ladies Memorial Association, as actual actors, right,
mhm,
participating in those groups. Not all of them, right, because poor women don't have the time or the
mhm,
capacity to be participants in that, but wealthier women do, and they are active in those
mhm,
groups. And the purpose of those groups, memorializing the dead, bringing bodies back home, that perfectly fits in with a widow, right, and what a
mhm,
widow would be interested
yeah,
in. So that makes sense. I
mhm,
think once you see the evolution towards the UDC and the development of the UDC. And I think Cox makes this really clear in Dixie's Daughters, right? They are daughters, right? It's not
mhm,
widows. Not to say that there aren't any widows involved. The UDC does kind of cater to these particularly prominent widows. Like they
mhm,
love to make a prominent widow an honorary president. They very much want those ties to those widows.
mhm,
But they are different in that sense, in that they are daughters, not widows, and widows become more of a symbol. for the
Mhm.
United Daughters of the Confederacy. They become the focus in the sense that they're the ones being celebrated, they're the ones being honored, right? And so
Mhm.
they're no longer being actors as much as they are being acted upon. They're the ones being celebrated and trotted out at these various
Mhm.
events. They're the ones being honorary presidents rather than presidents, although some of them did serve as presidents. Um, and so it's a shift. And
Mhm.
the timing makes sense in that regard too, because you're talking about late 19th century, so these women are older. But the UDC also is the group that really expands the definition of Confederate
Mhm.
widowhood, right? When they start, when they're accepting members and they're defining what it means to be a Confederate widow, they
Mhm.
don't say that you have to have been married to your husband during the
Right.
war. They just say you
Yes.
have to have been married to a Confederate veteran, right? So their definition of Confederate widow includes all of these young women who have married
Mhm.
veterans who are significantly older than them.
I was just
So
gonna ask you that.
they're the ones who expand that definition.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
and there's a quote I use in the book, and I can't remember who said it. It was a UDC member, but at one of their events, she's talking about Confederate widows, and she says, these women, the Confederate widows, they have something we will never have, and she says it in this, emotional kind of maudlin way. They had the honor of being married to Confederate veterans. You know, and I think that really kind of epitomizes the attitude of the daughters
Mhm.
of the widows, right? Is that they're just a symbol for them. They're
Right.
just something that they're kind of utilizing for their purpose of the lost cause, and I think that's the role that widows are playing in that capacity. Um, so yeah,
Well, and I think this is also sort of the interesting, like you already mentioned it, as sort of the broadening of the definition of who is a widow simply by marrying as a young, relatively young woman, a veteran. You become a you're now tied to the war, and once that guy dies, you are a widow.
right,
But it also was monetarily an expanding kind of argument because it was not just, oh, you're kind of physically tying the knot with the Confederacy by marrying somebody who fought for it, but the state will give you money when that
right.
guy dies.
Yeah, because the states really kind of followed their lead.
Yeah.
Um, they expanded pensions,
Mhm.
in the same way that the UDC expanded that definition. And the UDC, when they established these homes for Confederate widows, they didn't
Mhm.
distinguish between when you married your
Right.
husband. If you were married to a veteran at some point, and you were now a
Mhm.
widow, then you became eligible to get into one of these homes. Um, so for
And
me,
what
I mean, I think the UDC. It's interesting because it's really anyone who has any kind of tie is
Mhm.
valuable to them. I think that's
Right.
what it becomes basically. It
Mhm.
doesn't matter if you were born, 30 and 40 years after the war, as long as you have some kind of tie,
Mhm.
you're good in their mind. You're valuable.
Mhm. Which is crazy, right? When you think of like what was it, like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when like the last widow of a Confederate veteran dies, and
Yeah,
who knows, even like considering what Adam Dombey says, like whether these were actual veterans or if they just were false veterans to get money out of the state and sort of that lost cause. It's
yeah,
impressive how powerful and long living this thing is.
it is. It is very impressive how long it has endured.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, and it's kind of being resurrected even as we
Mhm.
speak, you know,
Right,
which is extremely troubling.
right.
I thought we
Well,
were going the other direction, and we seem to be reverting back at this point, which is very
well,
troubling.
I think in your state in that regard is really interesting because I think Alabama has a law on the books that prohibits the removal of Confederate
We do.
monuments.
Yes.
So, and it's kind of curiously bad because like the what these monuments represent is so problematic. What the messages they're sending
Yeah.
is so problematic. But most of them are put up to remember the soldiers that the UDC wants to remember.
Yeah. Well, and I mentioned earlier that project about the Freedom Riders and the article I
Mhm.
wrote for Destination Dixie. And what I didn't mention was that the counterpoint within that article was that the county, while it was doing nothing to acknowledge the Freedom Riders and the bus burning, spent an enormous amount of public money to build a Confederate museum and a Confederate wall of memory, kind of like the Vietnam Wall, out in a little town called Ohatchee, which was they built it right beside an iron furnace that was never fired, but it was built for the Civil War and then was destroyed by some Union troops last year of the war. So it was destroyed before it could be fired. And that's what the county spent money on
Oh.
rather than acknowledging the freedom rides and the bus burning. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
like, oh my God. It's
yeah,
yeah, that insane the priority sometimes southern states and counties and cities have.
yeah.
Uh,
It's
but
crazy.
mm,
It's crazy. Now, in my own town, Anniston, which is a post Civil War town, it wasn't founded
mm.
until the 1880s. We had a
Yeah, it's a
Confederate
railroad town,
monument.
right?
Hmm?
It's a
A
railroad
railroad.
town, right? Yeah,
Well, an iron town. Yeah,
yeah.
iron foundry town. Yeah. So we had a Confederate monument on the main
Mm,
thoroughfare. There's a
mm,
grassy median between, and it was, the typical kind of um, obelisk
mm.
monument, and the city council voted to remove it
No?
in violation of that law,
Good
and they
for
did
some.
remove it. Yeah, they removed it in the middle of the night one night, like 2 a.m. They removed it. I think actually they moved it out to where that wall in that Confederate Museum is. I think that's where it is now. But
Mm.
um, so the fine is $25,000 if you violate the law. And I don't know whether or not the city actually paid or not. Um, there was
That's
a
not a bad
whole lot
fight, I
of,
mean.
well, for many years, there was a lot of conflict over the monument because a local UCB chapter would always go and put little flags out there in April.
Mhm.
And of course, it's just the main thoroughfare. And so the city workers would clean up the flags. Every time they'd stick them out there, they'd clean them up. And so this would generate, all this hoopla in the paper and so on and so forth.
Mm.
And so the city ended up, when it came up for a vote after George Floyd, they decided we're taking it out. And so then when they did that, that of course generated a little hoopla because they did it in the middle of the night and all this.
Mm.
Which, I mean, they did it in the middle of the night because it's the main thoroughfare.
Right.
I mean, I'd rather they not shut down the street, the main thoroughfare in the middle of the day to remove this thing, but
Mhm.
nonetheless. And now, I mean, it's kind of funny. There's just the little like platform where it stood, and nobody really talks about it anymore.
Right.
Thank God. But meanwhile, in Jacksonville, they have not been able to get rid of their Confederate monument, which is in the square. They have a soldier, that
Mhm.
ubiquitous soldier that's everywhere.
Right.
There was an effort to move it, and people rose up in anger, and so it's still there. Can't get rid of that to save our lives.
Oh my. Well, 20,000 is not a bad fine. I mean, people in Alabama drive trucks, so
That are more than that, yeah.
accident accidents happen sometimes.
Yep.
Uh, I'm trying to flipping through your book real quick because here it is. McDuffie County, the UDC chapter erected a Women of the '60s monument. I thought that was interesting because where I was for a while in Macon, Georgia, we also had a Confederate soldier monument, and we had a Women of the Confederacy monument that I think was erected in the 1920 or something. So it's interesting that they were actually sort of the commemorative efforts again in regard to men and soldiers, but then also for women and especially widows,
Yeah. I mean, the
like
way,
commemorative in like statues.
yeah. It's funny. When I was doing the research for those women's monuments, there was actually one that was erected like in the 1980s. So
Oh
like,
wow,
yeah, as recent as the 1980s, which was kind of crazy. But
right.
um, anyway, putting that aside, the interesting thing to me about those women's monuments in the heyday of the UCV and the SCV trying to put them up was the objections of the UDC.
Hmm.
That they really didn't want them up,
Hmm.
and that was really interesting to me. The way
Mm.
that they, um, or not the way, but the reasons that they objected, that they didn't like the wording that the men were trying to put on there. They didn't like that the men were ignoring, for example, the UDC and
Mm.
the way that they were commemorating.
Right.
And I think to some extent it's also, what Cox was arguing is that it was the women's possession of the lost
Right.
cause. That the UDC really believed that they possessed it at that point and that they controlled it.
Right.
And it was, important to them that they control it. And
Hmm.
to the men trying to do this was kind of a way to usurp that. And I
Mm.
think that was part of their objections to it as well, is that these men were kind of trampling or trying to trample on their ground essentially by putting these monuments up, and the fact that they were not acknowledging all of the work that the UDC had done and
Right.
the way they were casting women's sacrifices during the war in purely a sacrifice language rather than a contribution language. They didn't like
Mm.
that because, all of
Mm.
the things that the UDC, when they talked about women, they talked about it not just in terms of sacrifice, but in terms of contribution, because they were actively contributing to the lost
Right.
cause. And so they wanted to talk about women's contributions to the war as well.
Mm.
And men didn't want to do that in that way.
Which is, of course, always is the irony. I love that, right? Of like it's
Right.
really reconstruction that they remember rather than
Right.
the war years when
Yes.
some of them had like these beautiful sheltered interior schools that they interior of the South schools that they went to and never really got touched by war or anything.
Right.
Um, so, but just as a question then, because I assume this is UDC, I was just kind of going back to the cover of your book of like, so this is, it says Jacksonville, Florida. So is this like a UDC reunion that
It's
you
a
have a picture of?
parade. Yeah, it's a Memorial Day parade, I think.
Okay. So like, was there a specific reason why you picked that picture? Because it like, just,
Um, I just liked it, really.
okay.
I just thought it kind of brought together the idea of the UDC and the role of women in
Hmm.
celebrating the widows.
Was it hard to find? like I know how hard sometimes it can be to find that picture that you really want and can't find.
Um, I think I found that picture quite some time ago. I
Mm-hmm.
had a whole, it was a whole thing for me with the pictures in the book because
Hmm.
I think I mentioned to you in my email, I'm not that technologically proficient. And so I guess I just assumed that some of those aspects would be taken care of by the press. And so, I just
Yeah.
kind of sent them these pictures and they're like, yeah, this needs to be such and such DPI and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, I don't know what that means. you know? And so it was a whole process trying to educate myself about what that meant in terms of acquiring
Mm.
these pictures. And thankfully,
Yeah.
there were so many, fantastic archivists and people at these
Mm.
these different libraries that helped me.
Mhm.
when I finally tracked down where I had initially found that picture. That
Right.
helped me get, the resolution that I needed of that picture because I
Yes.
did not know anything about, the resolutions and the
Mhm.
DPIs and all of that. It was complete. It was Greek to me. I did not have any idea when the editor sent me that letter. I mean that email about the different terms. I had no idea.
No, I remember when we, like, where the you remind me, like, I for my pic book, like, we we sent a picture because a friend of mine took that at Gettysburg, and then the press sent us the first cover version, and we're like, "That's terrible. What zoom in." And they were like, "Well, the resolution doesn't allow for it." I was like, "John, send me the raw file." So they got hammered with, like, a huge so we could get what we wanted. I hear you. If you don't know, you're
Yeah,
getting
I
stuck
mean,
with what the press wants.
I had no idea. And in fact, one
Uh,
of my pictures of one of the monuments, it was pure luck. The picture that I had was not a great picture. It was one. I can't remember where I had acquired it, and um, a friend of mine, a former colleague, it was over the holidays, and I knew that his mother, he was visiting his mother. I knew
mhm.
she lived near there. And I asked him if he would go into town and take a picture of the monument for me. And bless his heart, he did. He went and took a picture of the
Nice.
monument for me. And I was like, I promise
Nice.
I'll give you credit for the picture. And so he's now a credited photographer in my book.
Well, there's a means to get famous.
Exactly.
I I would have to go back now and actually figure out which picture that is.
It's one of the monuments. I'll give you a hint.
I will look. I will look later.
Okay.
Uh, so, like, to kind of draw to a close slowly, one of the things too that um, I was curious about, just very briefly, is that you did decide to put in the context of pensions, and you were very careful. I love that in the way you worded it of African Americans, camp servants, body servants, going and getting pensions eventually as sort of a process of sort of this lost cause evolution of like how can we keep this narrative moving in the direction we wanted to? Was was that a conscious decision that you felt like you had to do, or was this something where like political climate of the time you felt like I should talk about that as well?
I think maybe a little bit of both. I mean, I think, not every state did it. Some
Hmm.
states didn't acknowledge, but some states did. But I think certainly in the climate of the time, it's one of those things that always kind of comes up whenever
Hmm.
you talk about the Confederacy, and so it needed to be acknowledged. But
Hmm.
I wanted to make sure that it was put in the context of what it meant to the lost cause, which they
Hmm.
wanted to be sure that the only people that they were giving attention to were people who were loyal to white supremacy and that fit
Yeah.
their narrative,
Yeah.
and that they were not, recognizing these individuals as soldiers by any
Hmm.
stretch of the imagination.
Yeah.
And that's an important aspect of it that
Mhm.
gets lost in these people's minds who are asserting that there were black soldiers who fought for the Confederacy. There
Mhm.
absolutely were not. And, you know, they often trot out these
Mhm.
pensions as evidence that there were, and there simply were not.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? I mean, you live in Alabama. I bet you at least once a year hear something about Black Confederates and
Oh, yeah. That wall that I mentioned out in Ohatchee has a little section
oh,
dedicated to black Confederates. Yeah, it does.
I just don't get how they come up with that.
I don't know. I have no idea either.
Mm.
Which incidentally, I mean that place is maybe 15 minutes from Jacksonville State,
Mm.
and so it's the museum is dedicated to Confederate history, the county's Confederate and Native American history, And we have a fantastic Native American historian at Jacksonville State, and then myself for Civil War history. Neither one
Mm,
of us were consulted in the construction of that museum or the collection or anything. So, I mean, that tells you something about
mhm,
the effort there.
right,
When I interviewed the councilman who was instrumental in building it, is when I asked him why he didn't bother to consult with anyone, and I didn't say myself or Dr. Levi. I said you have Alabama down the road, you have Auburn, you have Jacksonville State, you
right,
talk to no one, and he said, well, we figured amongst us we knew enough history, we didn't need to talk to anybody. And I mean, I think that really just kind of sums up people who
mhm,
still adhere to the lost
mhm,
cause memory as a version of history.
yeah,
They don't want to hear from historians
mhm,
because they are so wedded to this
right,
fake history that listening to historians messes that up. And so they don't want to
mhm,
talk to historians because they have bought into this lost cause version. Um, and so that, they have no use for us.
yeah. I mean, I should be shocked, but I'm not. Like,
No,
it
I mean, it's not shocking. It's
no,
disturbing and upsetting, but it's not shocking.
yeah, no, it's like it's really the arrogance of it, right? Of like,
Right.
I know everything and all the books are wrong.
Right. All of those hundreds of historians were wrong. All of that evidence that you've marshaled in support of your arguments, that's all wrong.
Right. Like, I mean, it goes back to I always loved that aspect from Karen Cox's book, and I always told it to my students, right? Of like, the UDC gave a lot of documents and pictures to teachers, but they never gave the secession declarations. There's a
Right.
reason for that, because those
Exactly.
things were very explicit in why this is happening.
Exactly.
Um, well, but at this stage, we have chatted for about an hour and a half, so I think we kind of gave a good sense of what the book is, and we left a lot of little details to discover for readers. So I greatly appreciate your time today,
Well, thank
Jennifer.
you for
And
having me.
yeah, it was a pleasure. And again, I think it's a really good book. It was fun to read, and there was so much interesting information in there.
Well, thank you very much.
You are welcome. And for anyone who is interested in the book, it came out with LSU Press, and it's Sisterhood of the Lost Cause, Confederate Widows in the New South. All right. I am gonna